The Parthenon Marbles Dispute. Hello, I'm Richard Hold. I'm a barrister at 39 Essex Chambers.
And I'm Clarissa Levy, Art and Heritage Counsel at Wedlake Bell.
We're delighted to have with us today Alex Herman, who is the director of the Institute of Art and Law and the author of two books on topics of art and restitution. The most recent of those is called the Parthenon Marbles Dispute. So we're going to talk about that topic today. So Alex, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Can we start off with, first of all, what are the Parthenon marbles?
So the marbles were sculpted objects that were part of the Parthenon on the Acropolis in Athens. They were added to the building in the 5th century BCE as the Parthenon was being constructed by the ancient Athenians. So there are three primary types of sculptures that are included in that term, Parthenon marbles or Parthenon sculptures. We have the pediment sculptures that would have appeared at either end of the ancient temple. The metopes, there were 92 of these. They featured on the outer entablature of the building. And then the famous frieze, which wrapped around the inner chamber, the inner cella of the building, about 500 feet worth of sculpted marble. So they were all part of the original Parthenon. And that's usually what we mean when we refer to the Parthenon marbles, although sometimes that also includes other sculpted pieces that were elsewhere on the Acropolis.
Many of those came to Britain in the early part of the 19th century. Do you want to just sort of outline how that happened, and then we'll look at some of the legal and then the moral issues which come out of that?
So, as mentioned, the Parthenon, constructed in the 5th century BC as a temple dedicated to the patron goddess of Athens, Athena, and it remained a temple for hundreds of years until it was turned into a church, and then eventually turned into a mosque when the Ottomans conquered that part of Greece in the 15th century, so many years later. And it was then attacked in a war with Venice in the 17th century, and it became a ruin as a result of a bombardment by the Venetians in 1687. So by the early part of the 19th century, the former temple was now a ruin. Half the columns had been destroyed or had collapsed. Many of the sculpted pieces, which I've already referred to, were either badly damaged, destroyed, or scattered across the site. And some of the remnants of the temple still remain, but it wouldn't have been a functioning building by any stretch of the imagination by the time Lord Elgin became ambassador to the Ottoman Empire in 1799. So that sets the scene, I suppose, for what was later to come. Then the ambassador Elgin sent a group of artists and other workmen to Athens because he had this idea that to understand classical archaeology and to understand the designs and sculpting of the classical period, it was important for people in Britain to see originals or copies of originals rather than just, say, Roman versions of ancient Greek artifacts. So he sent this team to Athens shortly after he became ambassador. And initially, the plan was just to draw and paint and take measurements of the remnants of classical Athens. But eventually, that project shifted, and it became more about removing pieces from the Acropolis. And that happened in July of 1801, when one of Elgin's agents, Philip Hunt, was able to obtain a letter of permission from the Ottomans in Constantinople, which was the capital, to bring it to Athens, that allowed Elgin's men to access the site, to erect scaffolding, to do their drawings and their paintings of the works, but also to start removing some pieces of stone, which was the term that was used in the original document. So that started the process that took about 3 years for all these pieces to be removed from the site, brought to the port of Piraeus, and eventually shipped out, ultimately ending up in England over a period of about 10 to 12 years.
And what sort of scale of removal are we talking about? How much is removed and how much is left?
There are today at the British Museum in the what used to be called the Elgin collection, but now the Parthenon sculptures, there are 90 large pieces of sculpted marble and then other fragments, smaller fragments scattered about. So large pieces that were taken, it took a long time. The crating and the carting and then the shipping of these pieces was an incredible feat just to get that all done and to bring these pieces to England, but obviously very controversial as well.
Were these pieces, just to be clear, were these pieces sort of found in the ground because you explained the site was essentially a ruin, or were they removed from the building?
So approximately a third of the pieces that were removed came from the remnants of the Parthenon itself, so the entablature above the colonnade, and these pieces were sawed off of the architectural surroundings and caused significant damage to the remnants of the building. And then about 2/3 of the pieces came from around the site, so they'd either been excavated because they'd been buried in the rubble after the attack by the Venetians 115 years earlier, or they had been taken out of makeshift buildings that had been constructed in the intervening century by the Ottoman Turks, who were using the Acropolis at the time as a military garrison.
What authority did Elgin and his agents, so Hunt and so on, have from the Ottoman authorities to remove pieces from the Parthenon site?
Initially, there was a letter of permission that had been obtained by Hunt and Elgin in Constantinople, so hundreds of miles away in the capital, in July of 1801. That was then brought to Athens by Hunt, and that began to allow pieces to be removed. Now, we don't have the original document with us. It doesn't remain. It's been lost to the sands of time. But we have an Italian translation that was made at the time so that Elgin and his agents could better understand the terms of this document. It's a fairly detailed legal document. And the key phrase, so this is, you'll have to pardon my 18th century Italian, but the key phrase is qualche pezzi di pietra in that Italian translation, which translates in English to some pieces of stone, and then it continues with inscriptions and figures. So it allowed Elgin's men on the ground to remove some pieces of stone with inscriptions and figures, and that the Ottoman officials in Athens were not to impede this in any way. So that's the initial letter of permission. Traditionally, it was called a firman, which is an official Ottoman document that comes from the Sultan. Now, from my research, I don't conclude that it was a firman because it didn't come from the Sultan and it lacked some of the telltale signs of firmans at the time, of which there are many examples. You can see them in museums and archives around the world. But it was a letter with legal authority because it was signed by the Kaimakam, who was the deputy grand vizier, who was in charge of the Ottoman court at the time, just beneath the Sultan. So I think it had legal force, even though it wasn't a firman, and it allowed Elgin's men to begin the removal process, which, as I said, took about 3 years to complete.
And do you think because it said some pieces of stone, that could have somehow been interpreted as permission to chop up the marbles the way they were?
Well, I think that's one of the arguments, that this did not extend to that kind of activity because it didn't refer to the buildings themselves. It didn't refer to removing pieces in that kind of invasive way. But what we also see, and this is some of the research that has been undertaken by others, but I was able to benefit from, so I'm very grateful for that, in the last 10 or 15 years, a letter that approved of everything that had been done, which was sent from Constantinople in September of 1802 to Athens to tell the Ottoman officials there to allow Elgin's men to continue what they were doing and to show official approval of what had happened thus far. And then lastly, a final export decree. This one did come from the Sultan about 10 years later in 1811. So there were still some crates of marbles that were waiting at the port in Piraeus long after Elgin had left Constantinople. He was back in England at this point. And there was an export decree which was obtained by Elgin's successor, the next ambassador Adair, to Constantinople. And that's very clear. It refers to these pieces of stone that Elgin and his men had taken, that they're waiting in Piraeus, and that the Ottomans allowed them to leave. So taking all of that together, it seems that on balance, there was legal permission to do what they did. Now, it doesn't mean that we can accept it today as a morally justified expedition, but I think legally, it's fairly clear under the Ottoman system as it existed at the time, there was sufficient permission to remove those pieces that they did take. I say on balance because I don't think it's 100% convincing. We might find evidence in the future that disproves some of this, but I think with what we have today, with those examples of the letters of permission that remain and the final export decree, I think we have enough on balance to say that it did have the legal approval of the authorities at the time.
The context really, what you're saying is that the central Ottoman authorities, the Sultanate, knew what was going on, authorised that, and this is a project that had been going on for a long time. But I want to sort of ask on a couple of the issues which have been raised as potentially subverting the legal basis. And the first of those is the extent of any bribery involved in securing the removal of the marbles. And as far as we can tell, was there bribery, and what effect, if any, does that have on the lawfulness of the removal?
Yeah, so there was clear evidence of bribery, of paying off the local officials to allow this to continue for 3 years. And we have examples of what was brought to Athens in order to grease the palms of those in control there. So things like horses, jewels, diamonds, telescopes, European watches, and that sort of thing. Those were being used to effectively pay off the local officials. So there clearly was a form of bribery taking place. Now, bribery is something that was not acceptable under the Ottoman system as it existed, although it did happen. And you can look at some of the Ottoman rules that existed against bribery. You can see some of the principles coming even from Sharia law, that bribery was considered an offense. It was wrongful. Now, that said, if that was taking place, if there was bribery, then any kind of repercussion would have been found within the Ottoman legal system from the Sultan, for example. And the Sultan could have easily punished someone who had committed bribery, one of the officials, for example, but that never happened. So I think with bribery, it did exist. I think it has a moral bearing on what was done and how these pieces were taken and removed that might not sit quite well with us today. But I think legally, there's no direct effect of any bribery taking place because it never went punished within the Ottoman system at the time.
Is there also an aspect to the bribery issue that the bribery that's been identified is of the local officials, basically get them to not get in the way of Elgin's agents doing something which the central authority had authorized? There isn't, reading your book, evidence that the central authority, the Sublime Porte, was supported by bribery. So the authorization was got, it seemed, without bribery. It was greasing the palms of the local officials to do what they were meant to be doing, which is allow Elgin's men to get on with the job.
Yeah, I think what was happening in Constantinople, because the Sublime Porte was the diplomatic area of the capital, and there was obviously a lot of reciprocal gift giving, which, I mean, that goes on today in diplomatic circles. So that was par for the course there. But you're right, in these far-flung parts of the empire, it was more acceptable to be paying off the local officials to allow something to happen, even if you had a legal permission to do so. And I think there were references to this in some of the Select Committee hearings in 1816, where Lord Elgin, who was one of the witnesses, he said, well, a firman or a letter of permission is only so much as the local official will allow it to be interpreted. So you always have to give gifts or payments to those local officials. I think that still complies with our definition of bribery and how bribery has been defined historically as well. And as you say, Richard, it can still be a bribe even if you're paying someone to do something that you technically have a legal right to. It's an offense for that person to receive that kind of emolument. So I think that continues to be considered bribery. But as I said, the legal effect of that at the time was such that it went unpunished and therefore cannot be questioned or overturned in a sense. It doesn't have a direct legal impact on the transaction.
The other aspect I wanted to raise on the legal side of it, it's got a moral dimension as well, in due course, is that Athens at that time was ruled by the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans had been in control for, I think, about 350 years by that stage. It wasn't governed by the Greeks. And I think one of the points that's been raised is to what extent the Ottomans should be treated as an occupying power, and in that case, shouldn't have the authority to dispose of the subject states' art and antiquities. How far is that sort of analysis sort of useful to these particular circumstances?
Well, certainly, if you look at the Greek claim and how they project their interest and their demand for the marbles, they often refer to the Ottoman period as an occupation. And that's how it's taught in school in Greece. And that's some of the research that I did for the book. They call it the Turkocracia, so the rule by the Turks, not in a very pleasant way. And it was a brutal rule. And there's evidence from the time of foreign visitors saying that it would only take the support of the Western powers to allow the Greeks to finally emancipate themselves from a brutal overlord, the Turks. But whether we can consider that an occupation in a technical legal sense, I think is another matter. Occupations at the time, circa 1801, didn't actually impose any requirements on occupiers. Occupiers are actually free to do quite a lot of things that they couldn't do today, for example. Now we have all sorts of international conventions and customs of international law that say that occupiers have to treat a civilian population appropriately, can't damage any cultural sites or religious sites, and so on. Whereas back in 1801, there weren't those kinds of constraints on occupiers. So even if we did consider this an occupation, which is, I think, quite a difficult legal argument to make because the Turks had ruled that part of Greece for over 300 years, even if it was an occupation, I don't think it would actually place any restrictions on the power, let's say the Ottoman Empire, in terms of what it can do with a cultural site or a religious site or the remnants of such.
Okay, you've taken the story to the point that the marbles have left Greece, headed for Britain. This has all been done by Lord Elgin or at his instigation. How do the marbles then end up in the British Museum? And what's the role of the Select Committee, which you've mentioned?
Lord Elgin, through many travails, was able to bring this collection that he had amassed to England. And he realized eventually that it needed to be shown to the nation. So he put the collection on display. It was, quote unquote, his collection at that point. But he was having money troubles. And he eventually decided that the best thing to do would be to sell this great collection to the nation. And he asked the government if the government at the time would pay for it. Now, you have to keep in mind that the Napoleonic Wars were going on at this time. So obviously, the government of the day had other fish to fry. But by the time those finished in 1816, he had petitioned Parliament. So it would go through a parliamentary process so that money could be transferred to the trustees of the British Museum so that they could acquire the pieces from Lord Elgin. So he petitioned Parliament. Parliament commissioned a select committee to look into this. And select committees, I mean, they still exist today. And they were doing pretty remarkable work even back then when you think of everything that was happening in Europe at the time. And the select committee looked into this. They looked into Elgin's authority and how he had obtained the marbles from Athens, questioning it, investigating it, examining 15 witnesses, including Elgin himself. They looked at his role as ambassador, whether he had abused his position as an ambassador of the British, ultimately concluding that he probably had. It didn't look like he got the permission simply as a private individual, but actually possibly as an ambassador. But what they ended up doing, the select committee, was recommending a purchase price that was about half of what he had spent on the enterprise. So he'd spent over £70,000 at the time, and they recommended a purchase price of £35,000. Elgin was furious about this because he thought it wasn't enough. It didn't cover his costs, and he was having financial troubles at the time. So he wasn't happy with that. But the logic of what the select committee had recommended was that we don't want to encourage other ambassadors to do this sort of thing in the future. So if we're only giving you 50p on the pound, you're not going to be incentivized to do this if you're a British ambassador going forward. So they're quite canny in that sense. And then the third and the fourth issues that they looked at related to the importance of the marbles as architectural and archaeological pieces, and then their value. So that led to the valuation of the £35,000. So quite scrupulous in how they did it. And you can read the entire transcript of the examination of witnesses in their final report of the select committee. And to think this was over 200 years ago, it's quite a remarkable achievement to show that this little parliamentary committee was working away, trying to understand as best it could the truth of a certain scenario that took place in another country many years earlier. So I think quite a strong indication of how well the parliamentary process was working at the time in Britain.
But if anything, it makes even more of a moral and ethical quagmire to say this thing that's happened is okay, but it's not okay, and we'll have them, but we don't like it. I mean, it's incredibly complex.
Yeah, and it brings up the fact that even back then, circa 1816, what Elgin had done was by no means considered absolutely permissible. There were many who thought that what he had done was highly problematic. Lord Byron, the poet, was the most famous critic of Elgin's actions in Athens. But others, in the eventual House of Commons debate following the Select Committee's report, there were some who called Elgin a thief, a crook, that what he had done was spoliation. They actually used that term, which we think of as a very modern term, but they were using it in 1816. There was ultimately a vote, and the vote was in favor of acquiring the pieces 82-30, but a very vociferous minority, you could say. So the marbles have always been problematic. As soon as they arrived on British shores, there has always been a segment of the population and of the powers that be that felt morally uncomfortable with this collection coming into a great national institution like the British Museum, and I think that's remained to this day.
I think it's notable the controversies of empire, which people talk about now, were pretty controversial at the time. In all the various instances that get sort of raised these days, they were matters of immense debate. But something that was bubbling under at that stage, you touched on it a little bit, comes to fruition, is Greek independence, Byron being the leading British proponent of Greek independence. What effect did the Greeks throwing off the Ottoman control have on the issue of the marbles in debate, and how important was that to the new Greek state?
Well, I think it became very important. And in a sense, the claim for the return of the Parthenon marbles has very much played into the long narrative of, you could say, of Greek freedom and being able to achieve that freedom and that independence. So the War of Independence against the Ottoman Empire started in 1821. So barely a decade after the last shipment of marbles left the port of Piraeus, the Greeks were already kickstarting their war against the Ottomans, and on the Acropolis, no less. So the Acropolis was regained by the Greeks in 1822 and then eventually fell back into Turkish control. But after the Greeks defeated the Ottomans and obtained their independence, one of the first things they did in 1834 was to pass an antiquities protection law, a comprehensive one. So it's the first example of that anywhere in the world, a national antiquities protection law that very much saw the connection between the modern nation state and the ancient past. And so talked about preserving antiquities in situ, an export control of sorts that was already used at the time. So that's quite an amazing feat. And it shows you how integral the protection of the ancient past was for the modern Greek state. And just looking at it in comparison, this was 50 years before Britain first had an antiquities protection law in the Ancient Monuments Act of 1882. So Greece was very much the first to be doing this in Europe, and now every country would have some form of protection of ancient monuments and ancient objects. But I think that shows you how wrapped up the protection of artifacts was for Greece, and they even enacted a law that said as such.
I think we've discussed the sort of the legal issues and taken the view that there was the legal authority for Elgin to remove them and so on. That, of course, doesn't answer the debate about the marbles. What are the moral or ethical issues which come out of what was done and where the marbles have now ended up?
Well, I think part of that relates to what we've talked about in a legal context. So the bribery that took place, the fact that Greece was ruled by a foreign power, the Ottoman Empire, even if that doesn't have any legal purchase in the argument, I think it has quite a strong moral purchase. And that's, I think, something that the Greek state has continued to use over the last 30 or 40 years in its argument for the reclaiming of the Parthenon marbles. The way in which the pieces were removed as well, I mean, I mentioned that it caused damage to the remnants of the Parthenon, the way that pieces were taken out. But we have to remember that every single piece of the frieze, so we're talking about over 50 large blocks of marble, had to be sawed and chiseled in order to take the sculpted part away from the larger backside of the blocks of pentelic marble. So that caused damage in itself. And they were hacked away. Some of them had to be sawed in two to make them easier to transport. So I think that causes moral qualms, I would say, in the way in which these pieces were acquired, but also how they were treated at times by the British Museum. Now, the British Museum has, on the whole, done a decent job of looking after them, displaying them, undertaking research around the marbles, publishing books on them, etc. But there was an episode in the 1930s where a very wealthy benefactor, Lord Elgin, had intervened fairly secretly with the marbles and hired people to scrub them clean because they wanted the marbles to look as white as possible, which was the vogue at the time, even though now we know that the marbles most of them were painted back in the 5th century BC. But at the time in the 1930s, Devine thought these should be cleansed of any of the kind of discoloration that had occurred over the centuries on the patina, on the surface of the marbles. And that was discovered about halfway through the project. So now you can see at the British Museum, about half of the pieces have been effectively whitened in a very artificial way, and the others still have the remnants of the discoloration that comes with time and the effect that oxidization can have on pentelic marble in particular. So that was largely covered up at the time in the 1930s. It was also a time when Britain was about to enter a global conflict with Nazi Germany, so there were other things going on at the time. So I think that obviously causes some problems in terms of how the British Museum has looked after that collection. And then probably lastly, maybe most compellingly, is the argument that even though pieces are in a museum or have been in a museum for a long time, they can continue to have meaning, cultural meaning, to a community or to a country of origin. And I think that's probably one of the most compelling arguments that these pieces should be returned. And reunited, should be remembered that there are about 50% of what remains from the Parthenon is still in Athens, and it's now on display at the Acropolis Museum. So reunifying, you could say, the sculptural scheme of the marbles so that the frieze can be seen in its entirety, or at least of what remains after the destruction, the vicissitudes of history, in one place. So I think that's, in a nutshell, what the moral argument for return might be.
And it's all very well talking about a technical legal analysis, but after all, there's a huge debate to be had about what law even is. And I mean, it's just what we say it is, isn't it? And it's not always going to be perfect. It's not always going to be right. We're all great respecters of law in this podcast, obviously, but that does not make what was right once or what was legal once doesn't necessarily have much bearing on what is right to do now.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think morality and ethics, I think, have a tendency to shift over time, gradually. And I think we're in one of these conundrums when it comes to the Parthenon marbles and certain other pieces in collections that are controversial, where the law might be fairly stable, but the moral case has shifted, has changed over time. And that, I think that creates something of a bind when, say, the trustees have the law on their side, but might feel certain moral qualms about holding on to collections that were obtained in ways that they don't feel comfortable with from an ethical perspective.
For the last 40 years or so, the Greek government has been pressing for the return of the marbles. Before we come to look at solutions, how has the present debate been framed? How has the arguments been put?
Well, the Greeks, since they first lodged their official diplomatic claim in 1983, have argued that they want to reunify the sculptures, as I mentioned, that these pieces belong on the monument. That was originally what the argument was. Now it's near the monument because the Acropolis Museum is not quite on the Acropolis. And that the way in which these pieces were taken during the quote-unquote occupation by the Ottoman Turks was wrong. And so we need to correct that. We need to do justice for that historical injustice. So those are largely what the arguments have been. And they haven't really changed that much over the last 40 years. So those are really the main tenets of the argument. The current Greek prime minister certainly advocating for what he calls reunifying the Parthenon marbles or the Parthenon sculptures. He's tended to downplay some of the historical arguments around whether these pieces were stolen by Lord Elgin. He's focused more on reunification as the main argument. And maybe there are political reasons for doing so, but that's largely been how it's played out over the last 40 years. There's been quite an oppositional, I think, structuring of the argument, where on the Greek side, they'll often refer to these pieces as having been stolen, so the theft by Lord Elgin. And on the British Museum side, the fact that they were legally acquired under the laws that pertained in the Ottoman Empire at the time. So it's a real legal disconnect in a sense when you have one side saying this was stolen and the other side saying it was legally acquired. So that's been obviously a disagreement that has not been resolved over the last 40 years. And then there's also been what I would call a relational conflict. So the relationship between the British Museum and the Greeks historically has not been good because they haven't been able to speak to one another. They often speak across one another, including on points of the history of how these pieces were taken and the legal or illegal actions of the past. So that's caused this dispute to continue on, to be unresolved, for there to be very little room, in a sense, to negotiate because of those differences of opinion, quite strong differences of opinion, and the positions being so entrenched for so long. So it makes it a very difficult dispute. Even though it's just a cultural dispute, it's a very difficult dispute to resolve. And I think those are many of the underlying problems.
One of the potential counterpoints to the argument about, this general argument about restoring objects to the countries or the places or the communities they came from, is the role of the world's great museums, and British Museum undoubtedly one of those, as a world museum where it is possible to appreciate the contribution of the world to culture and history and art and so on, and to see some of the objects in close juxtaposition, both for the public and for researchers. How does that sort of, the question of restoration of the Elgin or Parthenon marbles relate to that sort of role of a great world museum?
The British Museum's status in this, I think, needs to be respected. I mean, it was created by Act of Parliament 1753, so even quite a bit before the Elgin collection came into its holdings. And it was the first national public museum anywhere in the world, and created by Act of Parliament, governed and run by a board of trustees. So it has an arm's length relationship with government, which is quite different from a lot of other countries where it's very much a state entity. So I think that's something that needs to be celebrated and recognized. And I think maybe on the restitution argument, it should be recognized that the British Museum has this historical role, which is quite an important one, of bringing this amazing collection together. And there probably hasn't been enough recognition of that on the Greek side, if I'm honest. If you're trying to build a relationship between the two sides, it's important to recognize the position, the validity of the other side's position. British Museum obviously has to do that in relation to the strength of feeling on the Greek side when it comes to the marbles, but I think the Greeks also have to recognize the historic role of the British Museum. And there's a law that exists, 1963 British Museum Act, which doesn't allow the trustees to remove objects, to dispose of objects from the collection, with some very small exceptions. So the legal status quo is that the collection has to be kept whole and entire in perpetuity, with just a few little exceptions for things like duplicates, unfit objects, useless objects, things that have deteriorated over time. So that's part of what creates that legal bind, where you might have a fairly compelling moral case to do something about a particular part of the collection, but the law telling you as a trustee that you can't, or it's very difficult, at least as it stands right now. So that, I think, is what creates that conundrum for trustees. And it's not just the British Museum trustees, and it's not just in relation to the Parthenon marbles. This arises in many countries for many different museums dealing with collections from many different sources. So it's one of the things that's happening now in the cultural sector, in the museum world, that museums are having to change, but it's very difficult for them to do so, especially when they have those legal restrictions imposed on them like the British Museum does.
Is one aspect of the modern world the ability to move incredibly valuable and sensitive items safely around the world, and the role of a world museum with exhibitions and borrowing items and so however it's put, that there are potential solutions beyond the black and white, this is ours or no, it's ours sort of debate, which we've had for the last 40 years.
I think probably that's the direction of travel for these sorts of things, that the oppositional approach that was taken in the past is no longer fit for purpose.
It can't be resolved.
Yeah. I mean, we could be here in 40 years still arguing the merits of returning the Elgin marbles, because we'll never get anywhere if we continue to stick to those entrenched positions, which is how it's been for a long time. So obviously, as you say, Richard, there will need to be some new way of imagining the role of museums, including these world museums or universal museums. And part of that might indeed be sharing of collections with communities and cultures of origin and others around the world. And sometimes that might involve a recognition that things are important to those outside the museum, that having an object behind a glass case is not necessarily the natural place for many things. Sometimes they're going to be used ceremonially in a community because of its national importance to a particular state, like in the Greek case. So I think that recognition is coming. I mean, I do think that the British Museum has changed a lot in the last 2 or 3 years. Just if you look at the language of some of their press statements and some of their positions, some of the things that George Osborne, the chair of trustees, has said, and even some of the things that the very new director, Nicholas Cullinan, has said publicly, I think they realize that it's an old institution, it's a bit of a white elephant, and it's a bit difficult to change. You know, big institution with all those traditions, that long history, that reputation, it weighs on it. So it's harder, I think, for the British Museum to change than for maybe a newer museum or a smaller museum, a university museum. I think they're able to adapt much more readily.
To return their shrunken heads.
Yeah, exactly. So that's happened in a number of university museums across the UK in dealing with human remains and dealing with some of the displays that they have that might be controversial. So it's harder for the big national museum that is the British Museum. But I do think that they are trying to turn the ship in the right direction when it comes to these discussions with countries and communities of origin, which is a positive step. And I think that's something that should be applauded.
Is there a question of language being used, loan partnership, and a question also what each participant would see as an acceptable or successful outcome, and those being factors which affect the ability to reach any sort of deal?
Yeah, exactly. This has been the problem with the Parthenon marbles, probably more than most other contentious objects in museum collections, because the Greek position has traditionally been that they own this collection, not the British Museum. That's the feeling, the very strong feeling on the Greek side. So they don't want to have to request a loan of something that they feel is already theirs. And so there's a political angle to that. And it's often been said that in the Greek context, the L word, meaning loan, is death, right? So no politician would seemingly agree to any kind of loan of Parthenon pieces from the British Museum. Rather, it should be a claim. But if you look at the history of the last 40 years where there's been a strong claim, nothing has been resolved. So obviously that's not getting you anywhere. And there's probably a famous proverb to be said about trying the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome. But there's possibly a way forward. If you look at what some other institutions are doing in the UK, like the Victoria and Albert Museum, they've returned material to countries of origin, and they've purposely tried to avoid the loan word. Now, that might sound very superficial because you're still going to have some kind of a loan agreement or a loan document, and it will have legal clauses and it will place certain obligations on the borrower. That's quite normal. It's standard in the museum world. But avoiding the loan word in some of the public communiques and some of the ways in which the relationship is built between the sides. So the V&A, for example, Tristram Hunt has been very public when he's talked about renewable cultural partnerships. So that's the term that they favor. And it might sound quite euphemistic. It might sound meaningless in some ways, but I think it actually gets the job done. And they've been able to do that.
It's about making it palatable, isn't it, to actually find a pragmatic solution?
Yeah, exactly. Because if you're in a relationship and you're trying to negotiate with another side and they're telling you that they have certain problems with some of the language, the best thing you can do, if you really want a workable solution, if you really want to achieve an outcome, the best thing you can do is to engage with that and try to work around that and try to work with that. So I think that's probably the way forward. There's probably some legal language that could be finessed in relation to whatever the agreement is. So there's been some reporting on this by the New York Times and the FT about what a deal might look like. And it wouldn't be all of the marbles leaving the British Museum tomorrow and going back to Athens as a semi-permanent loan. It would probably be a number of pieces, possibly a significant number, going back on say a 10 or 15-year loan. And then out of that, maybe a relationship develops, and then the two sides are able to achieve something beyond that. But at least for now, that's what the transitional position would look like. That's been the reporting on that. And I think in some of the details of the agreements, you could probably find ways of locating clauses that could work for both sides so that it's not too onerous on the borrower. A lot of museum loan agreements for international exhibitions, for example, place a lot of very stringent obligations on the borrowing institution in terms of insurance, in terms of conditions, temperature control, all that kind of stuff, putting things behind glass boxes and the rest of it. So I think if that kind of traditional museum language could be softened a little bit, and you make the two sides seem more like partners in this arrangement rather than the lender with all the power and the borrower who's the asking party with none of the power, if you can achieve some kind of parity or some kind of equity between the two sides in the agreement, I think that would probably bring things closer to a resolution. But as we always know, the devil is in the details.
Alex, thank you. That's been a fascinating talk through the history of the Parthenon marbles. And you've got 2 books out on the topic. I just want to remind us what they are.
So the most recent book, which we've been talking about, The Parthenon Marbles Dispute, Heritage Law Politics, published by Hart in 2023. And then before that, I wrote a book called Restitution, the Return of Cultural Objects, published by Lund Humphreys in 2021. So that looks more broadly at the issue of restitution or repatriation outside of just the Parthenon Marbles Dispute.
And can I, as a final question, ask, I know the etiquette of this is completely appalling, but I'm always interested to know what people feel in their hearts. And what would we do if we could decide, if we could wave a magic wand? Why don't we take a vote? Do the marbles stay in the UK or do they go back to Greece?
So after this long and nuanced discussion, you want a yes or no answer?
Exactly. Put us really on the spot. What's it to be? Richard, you first.
More sympathetic having read into it than I was to the notion of a partnership, not use the L word, but partnership, which allows some of the items to be reunited in one place or another.
Excellent. Alex?
Well, I think Richard makes some very compelling points there, so I'd probably side with him on that. I mean, I tried to be very balanced in the book, so I don't say one way or the other what the outcome should be. But I think if there's anything, I think it would make sense this day and age for the British Museum and the Greeks to have some kind of relationship and better understanding on these issues. I know that sounds like a bit of a cop-out answer, but I think that would probably get us forward. But each side is going to have to give up on some of its red lines, and we'll have to see that happen.
And for my part, I completely agree. It's all about dispute resolution, isn't it? And what this has made me reconsider is how much I respect the law. And sometimes there are more important things, and finding solutions that work for everyone, sometimes that has a value beyond a technical legal analysis. So Alex, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Art and Heritage Law Contested Heritage. Please do follow or subscribe on Apple or Spotify podcasts to enjoy more shows.
We have a new podcast out every fortnight. If you're able, please take the time to rate us and put down a review.
The show is also on the 39 Essex Chambers website, along with podcast series on topics such as artificial intelligence, climate change and planning.